Ta-da. All right, great. Okay, so module five, I'm excited to be here. I was fortunate enough, like Lily said, to have spent a good amount of time with the team at CPA and the the Kentucky Student Success Collaborative, and spent some time also with last year's cohort during the leadership exchange where we talked about service design and also some design thinking tools. So I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with the broader approach, but I know you all have had a couple modules that did some introductions into journey mapping and process mapping, so I'll do my best to build off of that. My background is in design research, so I've spent a good amount of time both in the public and private sector working in those worlds. So I'll share what I know. I will try to go slow. I'm a fast speaker, so if I'm going too fast or if you have questions, do not hesitate to interject. You can raise your hand or you can just jump off mute. I'm not precious about that. And then I'll also have room at the end to answer questions. Okay, so this is what the afternoon looks like at a super high level. We'll talk about, like I said, what you learned in the last modules, especially module four, and build on that in that service design recap. We will revisit journey maps and process map and talk about how we use those to create service blueprints. And we'll talk about how we take the current state view of a journey and then can use that to start to identify opportunities for improvements to create that future state map. The core tenet of all that work is co-creation, which, spoiler, is just collaboration, but we'll talk about that, both with students and also with internal stakeholders and partners that are part of delivering the experience for the student. Like I said, we do have some room at the end for conversation and questions. I will do my best to go slow. Feel free to interrupt me as needed. All right, so service design is what it sounds like. It's the process of designing services, but intentionally. We're going to build off what you learned about mapping in Nicole's module, which I believe was last month, where you learned about journey maps and process maps, when and how to use them, and then the benefits of them, especially when used together, which is basically a service blueprint. All those tools, all these kinds of maps are tools we use in service design. And when you talk about service design, the goal really is to improve the experience of both the user, which in your case is most likely the student, and the employee. So that, in higher ed, we can think about faculty, practitioners, administrators, staff. And we do that by designing, aligning, and optimizing an organization's operations to better support the student journey. Before we dive into some of those tools like co-creation and mapping, I wanted to introduce a couple more concepts or terminology that we use in service design that I think could help us think about how journey maps and process maps, when they're used together, can help us design a better future vision. There you go. So in service design, we often talk about the lines above and below the line of visibility. And those refer to the visibility of the service activities to the customer or user, which again, in your case, most likely is the student. So above the line are the student's journey through a certain experience and the activities that are visible to the student, which could be anything from a support person, maybe a help desk, maybe a faculty staff they interact with. So I'll use the student college admissions journey as an example because, like Lily said, that's very top of mind. We just wrapped a big study on that. Above the line is, in this example, the student going through the process from, in this example, senior year at high school, submitting their college applications, going through the process of applying for financial aid, waiting to find out to get accepted, and then all the things that come with kind of beginning and getting ready for college. So in this example, they may have to interact and have touch points with people like college admissions officers, financial aid support people, professors, counselors, other support people along the way. That's all above the line. Then we can talk about the below the line activities that are not visible to the student, but they're part of making that experience possible. And so in the student admissions example, we can talk about the broader college admissions staff and administrators, leadership teams, student advocates, behind the scenes faculty, but even things like technology teams that build platforms and websites that the students interact with, communication teams who manage that outgoing communication that the students receive, marketing, facilities, all those different university departments. They're all people who are part of delivering the service, even though the student doesn't directly interact with them. So that's how we think about above the line and below the line. One more way to think about it, and I'm not trying to throw in like a bunch of different visuals, but these two examples I've found in the past resonate with different people. So I'm giving you both, and I'm going to try to tie it back into how you've learned about journey maps and process maps. But another way that you can think about the above the line and the below the line is through a theater metaphor, which I've always liked. So if you think about a theater, you have the front stage stuff, which is the things that the audience sees, so the things that the student interacts with. If the audience is the students, if the audience is the student, the front stage here is the above the line things we talked about. This is what we also map out with a journey map. And I think Nicole also described this as outside in from looking at her slides. So again, lots of different methodology, but just choose which visual resonates with you to imagine how we can understand a journey through a process or through an experience. And then of course, backstage in this example is the parts of the play the audience doesn't see, but without it, that play wouldn't exist. Backstage represents the below the line or what we map out with a process map. And Nicole talked about that as inside out. So front stage is where students experience and interact with the service, but behind the line of visibility, the backstage plays a crucial role in the delivery of that service. And when we talk about service design or creating customer-centric or student-centric experiences, it's really important that we consider both the front stage and the backstage in any kind of design if we want to be able to deliver the best experience for both the user and the employees. Are there any questions on those? I'll pause real quick for a second just in case there's any questions, thoughts. Okay. All right. So the thing I want to focus on most today is the how, the process, and the tools that we can use to design thoughtful and efficient services for our students. And I am a huge believer in the value of co-creation. Co-creation, which is sometimes called co-design or even participatory research, it's really just the practice of collaborating with your users, your customers, and your stakeholders to guide the design process. It's a collaborative approach where, in our case, again, students, but also the faculty and practitioners and administrators all participate in the design and the development of a service, whether that's an existing one or a new one. And co-creation is really just intentional and continuous collaboration. It allows us to leverage diverse perspectives and experiences to create those user-centered, innovative, and effective services that we're all wanting to create. Maybe a quick tie back. I saw some of the notes from Jack. He's an incredible presenter and resource. So I know when he talks about good collaborative processes, the same apply to co-creation. And that's things like focusing on the whole system and how we work together, right? That's a lot of the backstage and below the line focuses. And then ensuring that improving the system is everyone's responsibility. You know, all those same principles apply in co-creation, which is just good collaboration. Oh, I love this quote. It's by Tim Brown, which is just a great reminder for how to approach the designing of services with, not just for those we are serving. And he says, it's not us versus them, or even us on behalf of them. It has to be us with them. All right. So I'll get a little bit into the nitty-gritty here just to think about, like I said, how can we apply some of these tools? How do we actually do this? Um, of course, there are a ton of different ways that you can create with students and stakeholders. I'd say, you know, the audience, their needs and preferences, the overall goal of the project, all those things should drive what approach you take. But in reality, too, a lot of times, right, like logistics, costs, access to certain tools and resources is always going to play a factor as well. So, you know, choose what applies to your audience, what serves the goals of the project, and what you have access to. With that said, I would say that when possible, analog is definitely one of the most powerful ways to involve others in the process. You all probably know this, right? You get in a room with a group of people and magic can happen. And so really that's all it is, co-creation. It includes simply getting together in a room. Often there's post-it notes or whiteboards and doing shared mapping sessions and co-creation workshops. I would say coffee and snacks are optional, but they are highly recommended. And I mean that seriously. You cannot be creative if you're hungry and cranky. So definitely considering, you know, the environment of the room, the environment of the group, yeah, the vibe of the group, you want to consider all those pieces when you're bringing people together. You can, of course, achieve a lot of great outcomes through digital or virtual co-creation sessions, and some of these examples are from the student co-creation workshops that we did as part of the student journey mapping we just completed with 50 high school seniors. And you can get great outcomes. Again, you can choose the best tool based on what's available, what's easy to use, and what enables you to collect the right information for the process. So there are tools out there custom made for this. Some of them are examples like Miro and Mural. They sound very similar. They're different companies. I linked both of them here. Those are digital whiteboard tools that allow you to collaborate with people in real time while on Zoom, and capture visual journeys, process flows, or even just like sticky notes in right there in the board. The thing that I like about Miro, I think Miro changes their stuff up every once in a while, but the nice thing about Miro is that you can invite non-users through a link and they can access the whiteboard as a guest on their own browser. They don't have to create an account, they don't have to pay for their seat. So you as the facilitator can invite a wide group of people without them having to create new accounts. I will say, and Stephanie actually made a great comment about this in a call just a week or so ago. You can use readily available and easily accessible tools like Google Slides to facilitate shared mapping or co-creation activities, right? Like you can open a blank slide, you can populate the slide with some activities, and there's lots of other tools. Like if your organization uses Microsoft, right, there are similar tools that you can use to serve that purpose of creating together in a space. Um, I will say again, different audiences have different needs, but also different abilities or different preferences. So in this example of the student mapping, Miro worked fine. We also used another tool that was a digital first tool, smartphone first tool, app-driven tool. And that worked great for a young tech-savvy audience like senior students, right? That was kind of an easy tool for them to adopt and to use. Whereas I've done a project in the past with, let's say, older generation lawyers who were a little bit more traditional in their preferences and approaches, and that required a different approach, right? So you consider their needs, their preferences, their abilities when you design the right approach for you. And then I just alluded to one of these other tools, but other tools out there can help you collaborate with students and stakeholders. These, I would say, are a little bit more complex and advanced, maybe, but they are resources that you can use. So there are tools like Indemo and Dscout, which Indemo is the tool we used for the diary study with students. But those are digital diary study tools that can engage students through an app or a web interface, and it allows them to submit in the moment ongoing reflections, videos, images, and notes all straight through an app, and just helps you map those as a journey directly on the back end in the tool. So again, a little bit more advanced. It leads to higher fidelity outputs, and we'll talk about what that means. But it can be a really powerful way to collect rich data, especially if you're trying to understand a journey over a longer time horizon, or maybe dive deeper into a journey or a harder to reach audience even, right? Like sometimes you can't reach your audience through certain means, so having access to tools like this can be useful. Um, I mentioned this earlier, but of course, in all of these approaches, I find the role of the facilitator is incredibly important, and we could probably fill a whole another hour on just that topic. There are different considerations, of course, for in-person and digital environments. Always have food, though. Different audiences, but generally, I would say think about that role like that of a host. Your main goal is to make people feel welcome, safe, respected, and heard. And that applies to all environments and all audiences. So co-creation principle as part of service design reminds us that in order to design or improve the experience of a service, we need to involve all its actors. But sometimes organizations misunderstand that principle, so I'm going to call it out here. Co-creating with students does not mean asking them to actually design the experience. It means you're engaging them actively in the design process, be it through participating in journey mapping, interviews, right, through observational research, feedback sessions on early concepts. So when you're facilitating sessions with students, be mindful not to ask them to design the service for you, But instead, you can think about ways that you can elicit information about their needs, their goals for using that service, their desired outcomes, their emotions, their pain points, their mental models, what's working with existing solutions and services, what's not working. All those types of things are learnings that can help you identify opportunities for improving a service or designing a new service. But you're not asking them to design the service for them. They're providing you their insight into their experience and their needs. And then, as we talked about earlier, internal actors, partners, employees, stakeholders, whatever we want to call them, anybody that's supporting the student journey also needs to be involved in the process. So let's say you're working on redesigning the college admissions journey, like we used as an example. Um, if the service designers involve every single actor of that journey, in addition to involving the students, they could be creating a stakeholder team that includes many, many different people, right? Like anyone from college admissions officers to high school counselors, financial aid officers, any support people who might be supporting the student on their path, whether directly or indirectly. And so that can be really challenging because, as you all probably know, everybody has different goals, they have different incentives, and they have different motivations related to their roles. And they might not be used to working together. They might be in different organizations or at least in different teams. And so true collaboration, breaking down silos, bridging those organizational divides to work together to co-create a solution as a team, that's what helps us center the student experience in an effective and intentional way. So I would say that's equally important as, considering the student journey and designing for that. All right, I have a quote from Jim Kalbach. He's a kind of a expert in the service design world, and I'm a big fan, but it's an important reminder, especially when we think about the internal collaborations we just talked about. Because the true value, I think, in this work really comes not from the map, but the act of mapping together. So the noun, from the verb, not the noun. So when you're mapping experiences and journeys, it's a collaborative exercise. We talked about that. And when you get to that point where you're mapping out the internal processes and the systems, you'll bring data with you from the student experience. You'll have that student journey done, hopefully, and you'll want to create the right journey map. And, a lot of times we think about how can we make this pretty? How can we make this designed? And, the right visualization for it. And it matters, but none of that really matters if you don't activate your map and make it come alive in the broader team of partners and stakeholders. Mapping together, the activity of being in a room and mapping together is what actually helps break down the silos, and only if you put the maps into action. So, if no one on the teams, the broader stakeholder teams creating that experience is actually influenced or, let's say, inspired by the map, it's not doing its job. So Jim Kalbach had another quote that I heard where he said, journey maps without collaboration might as well be wallpaper. And I think that's a pretty powerful way to think about the importance of the act of mapping, not just the map. Okay, so if it's about the mapping, not the map, we should also touch on the difference between low fidelity and high fidelity maps. Again, I'm not sure how familiar you all are with the term or that concept. So when we talk about fidelity in this work, it describes how closely an artifact, so that can be a sketch, a map, a prototype, how closely that resembles the real final service experience. So low fidelity means simple, approximate, often hand-drawn, and high fidelity artifacts are often more detailed, polished, and closer to finished. Low fidelity maps and prototypes are quick. They're sketches or sticky note maps, kind of like you see here, that show main steps, touch points, sometimes problems, but without much detail or visual details. They're fast, they're inexpensive to create, and easy to change. And I want you to note the easy to change. I'll come back to that in a second. Because of all those things, they're ideal for early exploration, brainstorming, testing ideas. Whereas high fidelity prototypes or maps are usually digitally produced, they are visually more refined, and they look more like a final artifact that could be shared widely or used for implementation. They communicate more clearly, they're easier to read for wider audiences, and they're useful for final alignment, handoffs, but they are slower and more costly to change. So with that in mind, I just want to remember that we should focus on low fidelity maps first because they invite more participation and conversation from the teams instead of presenting a great looking artifact. That all can come later, right? Like you can get to that point. But when you're going through the process, the alignment and the buy-in, again, the mapping, not the map, comes from looking, understanding, and making things together. Because when you share only or invite others in for feedback, once you have this high fidelity, super polished artifact, because if I'm being real, it's really scary and vulnerable to share in progress work. And I know this, we all have been there. But when you only share those finished things that are beautiful and polished, we basically are telling our partners that it's already done, right? Like all the important decisions have been made. There's no more room for change. But when you share the in progress, unpolished, messy work, you invite others into that collaborative shared space that is necessary to co-create. And that's when we can build that shared understanding of the current state and then work together to co-create new solutions. Okay, a quick recap. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Pretty good. So when we think about co-creation, here are some of the outcomes that we can expect when we work with our students and stakeholders. Obviously, user-centered design, when we involve our users or students and our broader stakeholders from the beginning, we ensure that the service is designed to meet their needs, their preferences, and their unique contexts. That results in better service quality. It helps identify potential issues early on. Again, low fidelity prototypes allow you to identify those issues early on where you still have time. You haven't sunk a lot of money into it, right? Like you have the ability to make changes and improve the overall quality and effectiveness of the service. You increase innovation because diverse perspectives and collaborative ideas can lead to more innovative and creative solutions. And we all know that. You have more user or student satisfaction when the users feel heard and involved in the design process. They are more likely to be satisfied with the final experience. And then last, of course, you foster loyalty and trust because active participation builds those stronger relationships between the service provider and its users or customers, and that leads to increased loyalty and trust. Just a note here that I added, I've included some additional co-creation tools like facilitation guides and some example agendas in the Change Leadership Toolkit that you all have received as well. So there's a little bit more that you can leverage in there. There's also a ton of materials online. So if you want more information, I'm happy to share some links. Okay, I'll pause for a second. I know I'm talking faster than I meant to. That's just what happens. So if there's any questions or anything you want me to go back to on co-creation, I'll pause here for 1 second. Okay. All right. Moving along. Thanks for the thumbs up. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about how we go from journey maps to service blueprints. What happens once you have that journey map, which is the student experience through a journey, and you start to layer in that below the line element that delivers the experience. The secret is a service blueprint really is just that, a journey map, so the student journey, combined with a process map, which is the institutional operations that deliver that experience. The journey map is the above the line activities visible to the student. The process map is the institutional operations and processes that are not visible to the student, but part of the service delivery. And that in a nutshell is a service blueprint. I didn't want to note again, I think I mentioned this, but it's really important that we always start with the student journey. The student is the user of the service that we are designing. And if we want to create a solution that serves their needs and goals, we need to begin with their experience today, with their current journey, and then map out the below the line elements that deliver that experience, and then identify opportunities for change within our internal processes to improve the student experience, not the other way around. Okay, I know this image is a little bit hard to see and it's a little blurry on purpose just because it was a client project from back in the day. So I've tried to anonymize it as much as possible, but I just wanted to show it because it's a useful example of what kinds of things we include in a journey map and a process map, and to show that there are different levels of complexity and details that we can include in our maps. So for journey maps, we should capture things like the phases. How does the student experience unfold? What are the stages of the experience? And ideally, when we describe those phases, we should do that using their language and their mental models to describe them, not our own. The users, who is involved? What are their needs and goals? This is where you could also include tools like personas, which I think you guys learned about in Module 4 as well. So that's another way to think about the user journey here. The emotional experience is really important and powerful. What's the student's perception of their experience as they move through it, step by step and phase by phase? You have the context. So who are other people involved? What types of environments is the student engaging with or within? And then the touch points. So what are the students' points of contact with not just the service, but the business, the brand, the product, or the service, or multiple services? All that is considered a touch point along this line right here. All that should be based on primary research and should be the starting point for any blueprint. And then for the service blueprint, you capture all of the above, the journey, plus the below the line processes and operations that make it possible. So again, theater example, what I just added is all the backstage parts. And the way I've learned about it, again, there's, different terminology, different kind of systems people have learned, but I always learned about mapping the people, the processes, and the technology that exist to deliver that experience. And then we often also include opportunities, especially when we want to create future state service blueprints. And you want to try to align those opportunities to the part of the journey where they apply. You can add in things like guiding principles. You can add in specific processes that apply to your organization. You can apply financial streams. You can put all kinds of things in there. But this is where we try to dig into in the opportunities, I wanted to point that out because we try to dig into what the pain points are that can be mitigated or eliminated. And then that helps us identify where the opportunities for improvement are with the end goal of delivering a better experience to them. And then sometimes that can also be opportunities to deliver a better experience to different stakeholders or partners or internal employees. And so I wanted to mention that because this example is actually a service blueprint for a B2B2C service provider. So that's why there are so many different levels here, because we're considering not just the experience of the end user, but we're also considering their business customers and partners. So again, depending on the context, the project, the goal, you can include lots of different information and levels of granularity in your blueprints. Okay, so we talked about some of the benefits of using co-creation as a principle in service design. A service blueprint, as one outcome from that work, it really helps organizations improving the customer experience. So you understand the customer journey, you identify areas for improvements, and you can create a more seamless service experience. There is data on increased efficiency of organizations that apply these methodologies because the service blueprint helps identify inefficiencies attached to the customer journey and helps you streamline processes, which leads to operational efficiencies. We talked about better alignment and collaboration, right? Remembering that it's not about the map, it's about the mapping, not the map. But the blueprint or that visual representation of the service delivery process can help teams, especially when you have multiple teams spread across an organization or multiple organization. It helps teams understand their roles in that experience and how they contribute to it, which then creates better collaboration opportunities. And then, of course, all that drives informed decision making, which I know a lot of us aim for. They help provide a clearer picture of the delivery process, helping us make more informed decisions about resource allocation, process improvements, and even the development of new services or programs. Again, all aligned to the students' needs and goals. Okay, we're cruising along. Maybe I am talking really fast. Any questions on that section? Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk for a minute about how we can move from that current state blueprint to a future state blueprint. The current state blueprint is important because it helps you understand what today looks like, but then you can use that as a jumping off point to imagine with your partners the opportunities for a better experience. So as a quick overview of what a current state and a future state blueprint do, we can talk about the benefits of each. Current state blueprint, we talked about this a little bit, but it really audits an existing service, helps you identify those pain points, and we will do all that in order to understand the current reality of a service, including the student interactions, the processes, and the supporting systems. We do that by co-creation. We talked about co-creation and some different approaches that we can take to understand the current experience and map the journey. We can use those approaches to identify the touch points, on-stage and backstage actions, and gathering supporting evidence. I would say that, again, primary research is critical in understanding a journey. Qualitative research is valuable here because it helps you understand not just what they go through, but why they go through it and kind of the broader context and mental models associated with it, with their decisions. So building a journey map as well as a process map should include qualitative research. And then, the benefits are, again, I mentioned the inefficiencies, bottlenecks, and pain points are identified and can be resolved. Okay, so a future state blueprint is a tool for us to envision a new service experience. And I think it's important again to say that a future state blueprint, when you have brought along and co-created with not just the students, but also internal partners, and when you have leveraged the principle of mapping, not the map, then you have brought along all your stakeholders and partners that need to be brought along throughout the entire process. Meaning that once you get to this point, you don't have to sell or convince as much because you're all in it together. You've co-created this understanding, and now you're co-creating this vision of what it could be. So, again, leveraging brainstorming sessions, prototyping can be quite powerful. That's a whole nother session in itself, probably. But just iterative testing to define that ideal student experience and how it can be delivered. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute when we get to the future state piece. Future state blueprints help us innovate, optimize, and align different parts of an organization around that service vision. So when you have both a current and a future state service blueprint, both of those together can help an organization understand how the service is delivered now and how to improve it, whether that's by fixing existing issues or creating something entirely new. And I'm using this example here again that I showed earlier because it's actually a current state blueprint of a service experience to which we added the future state, which in this case was adding a new technology solution to an existing service to solve a very specific customer experience pain point. And so when you look at this blue box right here, we have the customer journey and the touch points. So up here is the customer journey. Here are the touch points that they have with the service provider. And then you have the below the line items. There was a pain point that was identified in this part of the journey up here. And so if you look at the green row, we added this to the future state, this green row right here. And that is actually the future state where we showed how this one technology solution right here could address the customer pain point right up here at that stage in the journey. And we identified which people, which tools, and which processes were needed to create that new desired service outcome. And so now the organization, and there were other points within this journey that we identified, but now the organization has an MVP, they have a prioritized opportunity. This will make the biggest impact on the customer's journey. If we focus on this piece of the journey and create this new solution, we can impact the experience for our customers the most. So that's where they kind of allocated their resources and their time to start improving. All right. Okay, just to bring it back to that simplified blueprint example of the student's college admissions journey, let's say that in our current state view, we identified that at step 3 here, the student is going through financial aid applications. And let's say they are having trouble with the online portal, and that could be a challenge maybe with finding the information they need to make a decision, or it could be a technical issue with the actual portal. And so let's say we identified this as an opportunity area right here for improvements, and we take that into our internal co-creation session to ideate better ways we could support students during this step of the journey. And so maybe in this example, we were able to co-create a new solution with our internal partners and stakeholders in the room that allows a student to have, the right information when they need it, or maybe we find a way to give them access to a support person that's available to them during this step. Again, this could be part of our future state blueprint and an area of focus for process improvement. And you can imagine how we might now start adding details and complexity to the process map here. So if we get to this point and we have a future state opportunity, an opportunity for a future state service that we've identified, we might now outline what team would be involved, what kind of roles would we need to be hired to enable that experience, what processes or communication flows, what we need to design or redesign, what technology do we need to add, all those types of things we can now start to layer in here once we've identified that specific pain point. And then it's critical that when we do come up with potential solutions or ideas like this with our partners, we would also want to continue co-creating with students. So I mentioned that earlier, kind of the iterative testing and feedback and prototyping. Once you say, okay, as an organization, in order to solve this student pain point, we're going to change this part of our operations. That's all grand. But now you want to go back to the students and get feedback as you design the new solution continuously, as much as you can with low fidelity prototypes. Because otherwise you risk that, you might be solving the right problem, but you might be solving it in the wrong way. You're not the student. And so co-creation, I think the way to think about it is it's not a checkbox or a one and done. It's that underlying approach to creating a great service for students and getting continuous feedback from them or your main users as you implement changes and as you make improvements helps you stay on track and make sure that your solutions are truly student-centric. And I actually think that that might be it, Lily. I don't know how I flew through that content so fast, but maybe we can have a wonderful conversation if you want to have details about some of these projects. We can talk more about how you take the current state to get to the future state, the co-creation. Lily, if there are other things we want to go back to and dive into, we can happily do that.
All right, great job. Thank you.
That was fast.
It didn't sound too fast. So
Okay.
how about we just start by opening it up for thoughts and questions and as we typically do in our community of practice, thinking about application to our work as well as to our potential capstones. So interested in thoughts, reactions, questions for Lena.
And I can happily go back to any of these slides as well if there's any interest.
I have just a thought, not really a question, but I
Okay.
think the piece that stuck, one piece that stuck out to me was to not come with it kind of already mapped out so that you kind of turn people off into thinking, well, we've already got it figured out. We don't need your input. Because prior to hearing you, and you said it better than I just did, but prior to hearing you say that, I was thinking, well, as much work as I can do ahead of time to kind of map it out, then I can get people to kind of fill in gaps. But I guess maybe it's a balance between doing a little bit of legwork to save some time because some pieces are kind of pretty set in stone. Um, but not making it feel like, oh, I've already done this. I just want you to validate it for me.
Yeah, I think, yeah, this one is like once this one clicked for me, and I've started talking about it as inviting others into my mess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because as a researcher, I really love that mess, but it's hard to find that balance of like, here's a polished, beautiful thing, just take it. You can tell me if you like it this shape or this shape, but that's about it. And actually being vulnerable and being like, look, I don't know exactly yet. I don't fully understand. This is what I know. What do you know? And then it becomes collaboration. It's not, otherwise, we're just exchanging information. I'm telling you, this is what I know. And you're like, okay, this is what I believe. And it just becomes more of like a back and forth. But when you have these unpolished, low fidelity, messy pieces, and I brought information to these sessions in the example here, right? Like I printed out this sheet, for example. That was the first iteration of that final blueprint you all saw, where we had some of the customer journey mapped at the top. We then revisited it with the internal group. So we started still mapping with them what we heard about the customer journey. And then below, we put in some of the things we knew existed. Like we know that this team exists. We know we have this technology platform. We know this legacy piece in their technology stack that we can't change. So you come with some things that you know. But if it's too beautiful, if it's too finished, then we're all like, oh no, you got it. Like, you just do your thing. Yeah, that's a big one.
Mhm. I mean, Jessica, I also think, when maybe you do have an idea of what the exact right solution is, but when your partners come up with it themselves,
Oh, yes.
it really is so much better for the buy-in, the implementation. And sometimes people are like, hey, I might agree with everything that you've said, but I don't feel included in this work. So
Mhm.
now I may not even just share my own original thoughts with you, but I may not support this. And so you might end up creating some kind of conflict, even potentially. The process is uh, potentially, you're investing time in this collaboration, but the output that you get at the end is so much more, I think, likely for success, set up for success um, with your partners.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes it's hard not to jump straight to, oh, I know this will work, or I think this will work, but to live in the mess a little while longer and
Hmm.
come to it together. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that is such a great point. And maybe just like one little anecdote is in this actually the same project, we had a pretty hesitant client or partner who was dealing with some internal conflict or at least like misalignment with other leaders in the company. And we had put a strong focus in this project on co-creation, why it was why I'm using it as an example so much. And lots and lots of mapping sessions with our core client and then some of his kind of friendlies is what he called them, other folks who were kind of along for the ride. And by the time we got towards the end of the project, to finally present to the team members that he maybe wasn't so aligned with that he was anxious about, he was the one presenting everything. He was the one sharing the findings and owning them. And at the end of that session, he and the other guy were at the board together, like ideating on ideas. And so it's like those are the moments where like, okay, like that is a partnership, that's a collaboration. And to Lily's point, like now that person is actually along for the ride because they co-own that idea, they co-own that process. Makes a huge difference. Any other thoughts or reflections, or maybe even like if anybody, I know you all are all in flight with your capstone projects and working on the aim statements. If there's anybody who wants to just like throw something out to the group and we can use it for a minute to brainstorm, I'm happy to do that. Or think through things, what do we do next? How does this apply to what we have to do next? Which I think is the test of change or next for you all. We can talk through that.
I feel like in higher ed, there's not a ton of, I mean, it's getting a little bit more hot and popular now, this journey mapping and process mapping, like over the last few years. But I certainly haven't done it, when I was, boots on the ground at an institution, which was only just 4 years ago. And so, like, thinking about, do you see any of these tools over the last two modules as being a part of your capstone project? Because I know that it's very comfortable to grab the survey or, grab the focus group, grab some of the things that we're very comfortable with that we've used before to feel like we can understand the current state picture, et cetera. But is anybody thinking, yes, I think that this journey mapping could really help me illuminate, or this process mapping would be very valuable for XYZ that I know is presenting barriers for students? Is anybody kind of really digging in? I see David maybe giving a thumbs up. Anybody thinking about this? If that is something that so when you have your check-in with me, Stephanie, or Beth, I would love to think through that, I would love to think through what that could look like. And sometimes it's just like, gosh, that'd be the first time I did it. I'm not sure. Do I have all the tools that I need? Do I feel prepared? Um, Same, for the first time that I kind of walked into the room as the lead, facilitator of a process map. Um, but it really isn't as, well, I know that you all would be incredibly successful with your partners. So I would love to hear, Lisa. Yeah, if you don't mind to share a little bit about what you're thinking.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So basically, what we're looking at is that we have a problem with excess credits awarded to students when we record their joint services transcript. And so, since that's really considered credit for prior learning, we don't necessarily have to record all the credit. What it does is it puts them with issues with their financial aid, ability to, continue to get that kind of financing, and it makes them graduate looking like they've attended all of these hours that aren't really going towards their degree. So I think that us, looking at that process of when and how we choose to record these credits would be a really good way for us to identify how that might impact the student in a more positive way. And, it would be a very individualized approach, but I still feel like it's something that's worthwhile for this population of students.
That's a great candidate for that approach. And I was going to say too, I think choosing a targeted focus area can be really beneficial. And I have seen huge success in process maps that are focused on communications, that are focused on very specific like touch points like that for something very specific, like recording those credits. But also like forms. I've seen projects where people mapped out the different types of intake forms, for example, that existed across, multi-matrix organization or multiple organizations, and just pinning those up next to each other in a room, identifying the discrepancies, the confusion, right? Like the differences that exist, and just changing wording, improving things. And like, I think sometimes it can be a little intimidating to be the champion of this kind of work because, to Lily's point, right, if it's newer in your environments, you're kind of the odd one out that's telling everybody, come on, let's do all these post-it notes, it'll be fun. But a lot of it you can do kind of sneakily. You can just call a meeting and just make sure you have a room with a whiteboard and you can start capturing things as people talk and put that up on the wall kind of sneakily, oh, it's just happening. And then as they talk, say, well, maybe we can come up to the wall and look at all the post-it notes. And they might say, oh, I disagree with that, or I've seen that. And you're co-creating, and they don't even know it. So you can kind of sometimes sneak the peas in with the, whatever. But yeah, I think that would be a great project to try that out. Are there any other examples that anyone can think of where you might leverage some of those tools? Anything that's currently going on or that you're exploring?
I'll share a little bit about my project. So I'm still nailing it down to be transparent, but if you could see my whiteboard in my office, it is full of these kinds of things
It's
because
a
that's
beautiful
just
mix.
how my brain works. So what we've been working on for a few months already, and it kind of naturally works with this and the capstone in general, I think, is we're a relatively new Slate institution using Slate for student success. We've been using it for admissions for a little bit now and advancement, but now we have a student success instance. And so there's a group of us that have been meeting for a year and a half now, but now more focused on workflows and understanding what they are, how to use them, because what we have is we either have a form in the system that the student submits and it creates an email that goes to a bunch of different people, and it's not clear who needs to take action when, and first and second and third and fourth. So trying to think through a workflow of like, first it goes to this person. Does this person aware of it? Yes. Have they done what they need to do? Yes. Goes on to the next person. So partly that, but then also we have uh, you know, processes that are like a paper form, paper, like a digital, like a PDF that you download, you have to fill out and then email to somebody, putting that into an electronic system. And then we just have workflows that are just emails back and forth until it goes to the right person. So what we've been doing as part of these conversations and flow charts and thinking through like here's where and what I'm probably going to struggle with is like the student experience piece of it because it's so behind the scenes for us, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing, but um, I feel like if we were to kind of survey the students, they wouldn't really have much feedback because it's just a form they submit and they don't really need to know what happens or really need to know the result in some sense. So that's I'm just trying to make sure that we're thinking about this the student experience like you talked about. So that's I think that's how it could apply because I literally have something right over my shoulder.
Yeah. That's a really interesting problem. Is that workflow exist already then and will just need to be streamlined and simplified, or does it not yet exist for the students in the way that you're working on it?
So it exists, but it's very much like a few people know what to do first or second. So here, an example, if you can indulge me, is basically when a student submits a withdraw from the university. So they're telling us they're not coming back. That form is submitted by the student, and then it goes to maybe 6 different people or departments.
Okay.
And there's one person in particular, the registrar, who's super fast, which is great. Great quality to have in most other instances. But what we want to do is first like check in with the advisor and say, hey, did you know that this person was withdrawing? This happened last week. And the advisor said, oh, wait, no. She just
Okay.
meant to withdraw from her current classes, not from the university as a whole.
I
But
gotcha.
if that had been like, so then I sent a quick email. It said, wait, hold off on this. Versus if we're putting it in a workflow where it's like, okay, the first step is always the advisor. They could have told the student to submit the form. And so that's an
Yes,
easy, yes, we were aware, move it on to financial aid, for example, or the bursar, whoever else needs it. The registrar should be probably the last person because they close them out of our
I
system.
see.
And so it does exist. It's just very unclear, and we hired a new registrar, and I think she's bringing to light like a lot of what you all do doesn't make it. It's just like
Yeah.
held in people's brains and doesn't really make sense to a new person. And
Yes.
so,
And that's actually a great excuse to do a map, whether that's just a
Mhm.
process map or a flow chart, like you kind of described, because when you have a new person and it's like, why doesn't is none of this documented? It's like, well, maybe we could document some of it to make sure that we pull it out of our brain. So when the next person kind of onboards, it doesn't happen again. Um,
Mhm.
but so it sounds like the students in this case don't actually know that this below the line stuff is happening, right? It's all kind of behind the curtain for them.
It is. And what we're trying to do more of is just closing the loop for the student. So, like, and this sounds, some of you who already do this can be like, how have you not been doing this? But basically, when they submit a declaration of major change, we let them know that it's been approved and processed. Otherwise, they just see it later
Hmm.
when they go to check their system or when they're meeting with their advisor. They're like, oh, it did get updated.
But that's
Or
manual.
it's manual. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then they would have to seek it out. Now we're trying to loop back and say, hey, this was approved. Thanks for submitting this. Same with like back withdraw, back registration, back drop, those kinds of things. It says this has been approved. And like you now have access to the course or you're now dropped from the course or whatever. So there's like the blips. I feel like the first blip, which is the student submitting the form, and then the blip at the end where they just are told what happened or the conclusion. And then most of what's in between is kind of a backstage below the line,
Yes.
thing.
Okay, so from what you're describing, it's almost sounding like yes, it's valuable, I think, to understand the touch points that exist with the student. Those might be like, let's say, your bookends, right? Like you have the student submits, the student has closure, and you can, very simply draw those out, and that might be all that exists for the student as far as they know, and they might not need to know more, right? Like unless you have clear evidence that the students are like, there's not enough transparency, I want more communication, I don't know what's going on. Sounds like in this case, it's more about like the internal piece. So in this case, I would almost think about all the different partners that are required to complete this process as the customer. It's almost like a business to business process where you're working with other stakeholders to deliver that experience and you're trying to improve it for them. And in turn,
Mm.
you will improve the student experience. So I would say in your example, it probably is the right approach, like what you were instinctually already doing, which is just getting those people in a room or whether it's a virtual room, maybe you have a whiteboard you can use and just map out a couple examples of how it happens today and say, if we change this simple, communication flow from this person moving up here instead of being back here, that could solve, half of the problems. Like it might be more of a below the line targeted mapping with a little bit of awareness of, obviously being aware that it doesn't negatively impact the student experience. But if the goal is to make that transition more seamless, not having any accidental deregistration, I think you said like could happen if it doesn't happen in the right order. So that's how I would focus that one, I think. That's an
Thank
interesting
you.
one.
Great.
Sorry, I
Thanks,
talk
Lena.
so much.
No, that was super interesting. Yeah, no. And we can talk about all these things again in the community of practice, but if there's any other thoughts, top of mind, questions, ideas, we can use this time to chat.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lena, for the presentation today. I will go ahead and just wrap us up really quickly. Um, Stephanie, thank you for putting the link to the feedback form in the chat. Please take, 2 minutes and fill that out for us. We really, really value all of that feedback. We will be sending a follow-up email to you all once all of this is posted on the Impact Exchange, so you can access the recording, you can access the deck. Um, and of course, you have your toolkit, which has some facilitation guides and also just hopefully some helpful resources for you as you consider how some of these tools may fit into you and your work. Um, the only other thing just as a reminder, we're going to be doing check-in meetings, and our real goal is that everybody feels very confident in your project and what your next steps may look like. And I think that we had a couple of maybe friendly reminders or like maybe helpful tips last time and just say, I know people's schedules will get busy in January. So if you're anticipating some stakeholder group meetings or, something to that effect, saving time in advance is helpful. One of the biggest things that we learned last year in the capstone was just that when folks got, again, super busy into the semester, it was really hard to find time on everyone's schedules and really hard to kind of make time for the work. And the students, are kind of the same. So just something to think about. If anybody has anything else, you can feel free to drop us an email. But appreciate y'all and hope you have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you all. See you in a couple weeks. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
See everyone.
Anita.
See you, Chip.
Bye, Chip.